you can look into and share with these people. And that has to do with the lighting issue, because that's an issue we already have with some of the other types of towers we have. Where do you have the FAA requirements for safety versus the people that surround these things and go, don't want that shining in my bedroom window. If you have any research on that, I think that would be helpful, because I'm sure that's going to come up and we're going to have to build it into the ordinance of some kind.
In regard to lighting, really what the ordinance is identified and sort of the specific language they used was just to follow the rules and regulations of the FFA, or the FAA, excuse me. And so it didn't particularly lay out what those regulations were, but sort of gave the impression, consult the FAA and make sure you're following their rules before we get a permit.
In other words, set your own rules and hope they work. Okay. And then the other question, or comment I have really, and I don't know if you ran into this either because you didn't actually talk to the people that fashioned these ordinances, but under the visual effects and the possible appearance difficulties, I smell a barking dog nuisance issue when we come to writing such an ordinance. So we don't want to lay it on the cops to decide whether this is something that's a nuisance or not. And when you get those vague areas, it can happen. But maybe some of what you find out will
Well,
help with that.
I'm wondering, maybe you can answer this, Kathy, or staff. I mean, there are times that we have ordinances that are written that, you know, if you want to do something in your neighborhood, you've got to get, you know, input from your neighbors or agreement or, you know, a certain percentage of your neighbors. So, I mean, is that something that you think might be?
Then you get into the variance muck, and I don't know if you want to write it to that or not, but it's something that could be considered when you're taking her information and when staff gets further into this. Certainly that could be, and the whole concept of possibly doing it by a neighborhood, which Commissioner Johannesson brought up. If you think of some of our densely populated neighborhoods, rather than every rooftop, would it make more sense to encourage looking into that? And who knows, we may be ahead of it as far as needing to wait for more technology, I don't know, but these are all really good. I'm glad you brought up all these issues, because I know we'll hear them 15 times over.
Felicia, did you see in looking at the other ordinances, were there any kind of, you know, local consent or neighborhood, you know, having to check in with the neighbors before you were allowed to move forward kind of things?
What I identified in regards to the noise issue was that most of them set it at a 50 decibel standard.
Yeah.
And when you put the turbine in, you actually have to go through a process of having it measured, the sound measured downwind. And so that's sort of how they went about regulating it. But I know that when I was doing research sort of on Maplewood has a noise allowance permit. So if you're going to be making more noise than the acceptable amount under ordinance or law, then you can have neighbors sort of sign that. I actually just saw that today. So
Madam
that's
Chair,
something,
in addition to the noise issues in regard to Commissioner Yingling's comments, so the city allows certain things with what we call an administrative variance. That might be a possibility for allowing a wind turbine in someone's backyard. And it basically requires approval from all the adjacent property owners.
Okay.
And if they're not able to obtain that, those approvals, they can still proceed and bring it to perhaps the Environmental Commission for recommendation to the City Council. So there's a couple options there when we start looking at this further.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? Commissioner Yingling?
Did you notice, Felicia, when you were looking at some of our neighboring communities, did they specifically mention the Mississippi Flyway in any way and talk about setbacks because of that, or?
Not that I saw. Basically, the ordinances sort of fell into three categories. Some of the ordinances were all renewable energy. So the ordinance spoke to solar and wind. The other sort of version, or the other group identified, was the Minnesota Model Wind Ordinance that the state made back in 2005. That basically these different communities and cities basically adopted the word-for-word language of that model ordinance. And then the other group was sort of the eccentric, where the different communities just sort of drafted their own language. But in none of the ones was there specifically anything about that.
Okay. And in your report, do you identify those that are the ones that just took the model wind ordinance as verbatim? Because it would be helpful to know which ones those are.
Yep,
Okay,
definitely.
great. Thank you.
Commissioner Schreiner?
Yeah, I know I asked earlier about efficiency differences between the vertical and the horizontal, but the other question being, we were bringing up noise too, is have there been any studies on the difference on the noise created and the frequencies between the different types of generators?
Well,